Okay, this unit that we're going to take a look at in Unit 5 is memory and thinking. So how do you process the things that you see, hear, smell, and so forth, and store it to later be retrieved and used later? So this is kind of a great unit to be talking about right before semester finals. So hopefully it gives you some ideas, some strategies to help with your finals. So your three essential statements that we are going to take a look at in this unit are explain the three processes of memory, the different types of memory, and some strategies to retrieve memory. So to begin with, we're going to talk about the process of memory. So there's three processes. First, encoding, storing, retrieving. And the process just completely repeats itself over and over again. One part can never really work by itself. It always relies on the other parts. So first we're going to focus in on encoding. Okay? Encoding is the transferring of information so your nervous system, your brain, can process it. And so you use your senses to establish a memory. So the easiest thing to think about is the things that you see. So in my image that I have there, I am seeing a blue oval, and my nervous system, my brain is processing it to be later stored and then possibly later retrieved. So we're talking about encoding, storing, and retrieving all in that process. Encoding simply really is just like the video camera. Things that you are videotaping, you're seeing to be used later. Okay? And a lot of it relies heavily on your senses. Now when we talk about encoding, there are three codes to help with encoding and improve your encoding. So improve your transferring of information. So when we talk about things that are being stored in your memory, the more emphasis you put on encoding it, the more likely it is to be stored in your long-term memory. So your three codes are acoustic, visual, and semantic. Acoustic is simply just repeating it out loud. So if I give you a shopping list of 5 items, you probably just say it over and over and over. Apple, bananas, pears, apple, bananas, pears, apple, banana, pears, and you'll start to remember it. So when you go to the grocery store, you remember apple, bananas, pears. Visual is creating some type of mental picture. Okay, whether that's a story about a bear and a tree, or where you maybe see the words on the page that you're looking at. So some type of mental picture to help visualize what you need to remember. Final is semantic, making some sense of what you need to remember. So the example that you see here is the treble clef. And the way to remember the notes of the treble clef is that they've determined face. So you have the F-A-C-E, spell face. Okay? Same thing when you think about a mnemonic device, making sense of something. The common one that I've used in the past was the order of the planets. So my very eager mother just served us nachos helps us give us the order of Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. I made sense of the order of the planets by creating a device to help me remember it. And so when you think about numbers that you remember, whether it's phone numbers, addresses, social security numbers, if you can easily remember that information, that means you put a big emphasis on encoding it. Whether that's acoustic or visual or semantic, you've done some type of code to help you remember it and store it in your long term. So the example I used in class, many of you could recall the number of your parents' phone number. Okay, you put big emphasis on encoding it and putting it into your long-term memory. When I asked you to recall the number of a friend of yours on the phone that you maybe text or call regularly, many of you couldn't remember it because you haven't put a big enough emphasis on encoding it to remember it. The next process that we see is storing. This is where your memory comes into play. Okay, so the amount stored depends on the effort you put into encoding it. So if you put great emphasis on trying to remember something, you spend 5 minutes every day trying to remember this phone number, more than likely it's going to be stored into your long term. So one example of this would be my credit card number, which is really sad to say. I guess maybe I have a shopping problem, but I have encoded and put a great emphasis on encoding my credit card number so that I can use it when I make online purchases. So I don't have to take out my credit card anymore. I remember my digits on the front, my expiration date, and my number on the back. So the types of memory is where we'll see the encoding process filter into. So you have sensory, you have short-term, and you have long-term. And we'll talk about those in great detail a little bit later. Next process that we see is retrieval. Okay, so encoding was videotaping it, storing was pushing save, retrieval is now you're watching it again, you're playing it back. Okay, so retrieval is calling up yet stored information, bringing that information to mind. So taking it from your long-term memory, taking it from short-term, and putting it out so you can write it down or remember it. Okay, if it's easy for you to remember it, it's because you have spent a great deal encoding it and storing it. So if you struggle, if you're trying to take a test like the kid in the image right there, and you are struggling, it's probably because you didn't put a big enough emphasis on remembering that information. So there are several methods for retrieval, and we'll hit on those as well. But those are your three processes. Encoding is recording it, storing is pushing save, and retrieval is pushing play. So let's talk about your types of memory now. So ES 18 are the different types of memory. So you have sensory, you have short-term, and you have long-term. Sensory memory deals with your senses. Okay, your senses, you have 5 senses. It's almost sensory overload. And so if you think about a class period that you're in, everything that you see, hear, taste, touch, smell, okay, you don't remember it all because your sensory memory is filtering out and preventing you from being overwhelmed. Okay, your sensory memory is deciding what is important and what is not. So if you listen to a lecture, more than likely your sensory memory, okay, is putting emphasis on your hearing versus on what you are smelling. Okay, so sensory is stored for a very, very short amount of time. It's filtering out your senses that you see. Short-term memory is very limited capacity. Okay, they generally say limited for a capacity of 7 items, so like a telephone number. Okay, short-term memory can also be attributed to you memorizing something the day or the class period before a test, throwing it out on paper, and then you don't remember it anymore. So ways to help keep information for short-term memory. Okay, so first you see maintenance rehearsal. That's just you repeat it over and over again. So if you look up a phone number in the phone book and you have to remember it and go to your phone and type it in, you'll probably just say it over and over and over again. Another common and easy effective way is chunking it, so grouping items to make it easier. So you chunk your phone numbers into groups of 2 or 3. And many of you do this. If somebody asks for your phone number, you might give them 1345 instead of 1345. So here's an example of 555-6794 could become 555-6794 instead of 555-6794. It's almost too long. If you chunk it, it's a lot easier. Okay, and if when we talk about short-term memory, one of the effects that we also see is remembering the first part and the last part of a list. Okay, so primary recency is if I give you a list of 10 items, you'll probably remember the first 2 and the last 2, and you forget everything in the middle because your brain has put emphasis on the first thing they've heard and the last thing they've heard. Okay, so short-term memory. Okay, we also have working memory, so that includes both your short-term and your long-term. So shorter events, things that just happen, and your long recalling information for that current situation. So you just witnessed something, that's your short-term memory, but you draw something from your long-term memory that has some relation to it. So that's working memory. We also see long-term memory. So you're restoring it for an extended period of time. And so to help with your long-term memory, you probably put emphasis on your encoding processes, those encoding codes that we saw before. Okay? And there's even a couple different types of long-term memory. Semantic memory deals with your knowledge of language and facts. Episodic is memories of your own life. So when I asked you the question if you could remember the house that you grew up in, many of you could remember it. That's episodic long-term memory. Declarative is kind of combining your semantic and your episodic. So maybe you remember your first period or your first grade class and you remember some day when you were learning about Abraham Lincoln. Okay, procedural is the common one that you see in athletics or even in band, that you can unconsciously perform something that you've learned through conditioning without really thinking it. So when I go out and I play basketball, I'm not sitting there and overly thinking, okay, now I need to shoot. It's automatic. Okay, so those are your types of memory. ES 19 is dealing with retrieving it. Okay, so now that we have encoded it, we have stored it, at some point you're going to possibly be able to or need that information again. So we kind of see two different types. We have recognition, so you identify maybe an experience, okay, with your retrieval. So you can't remember your first grade teacher off the top of your head, but if somebody says it, you recognize it. So that's recognition when it comes time for retrieval. Same thing goes, maybe if I hum a song, you might recognize the tune of the song. Recall is you reconstruct an experience. And so the video you watch, there is some lady who is trying to recall a crime that was committed against her. This is where you see a lot of false memory. That's why a lot of police officers, when a crime has been committed, they have to get eyewitness testimony right away to prevent false memory from playing into effect. So when we talk about retrieving information, the ways to help improve your memory and retrieve it: rehearsal, okay, so relating some information that you learned to something that you already know. So if I have to remember these random letters, I could make the word friend out of it to help me remember. The biggest and easiest one is using a mnemonic device. Okay, so there, my very eager mother just served us nachos helps with remembering the order of the planets. A lot of times, any type of encoding code that you use is also a good code to retrieve that information. Okay, so that is your notes over memory. So the processes of memory: encoding, storing, and retrieving. Remember, think of a video camera, recording, saving, and pushing play to watch it again. The types of memory, so once it has been encoded, where does it go within your brain? And then how do I recall that information back again to be used later?